Hello, welcome back to Introduction to Sociology with Dr. John, and today we're talking about politics. So we all love politics, right? Well, let's talk about politics. What is political power? Generally, when we refer to politics, we're referring to a particular process by which individuals or groups use group processes to acquire and exercise power over others. So in this sense, politics you'll find in any organization, even in the school you work in, there's politics. Who's going to be on the student council? Who's going to be the head teacher? Who's going to get a promotion? So all of these things might be subject to political machinations, as it were, behind the scenes. This right now we're going to be talking more about macro politics, politics at the level of the state and society as a whole. So political power is that type of power organized and used by the state. Well, what is the state? The state is that organization responsible for the formation and enforcement of rules and policies that are binding, that is, required, in a given territory. Right? So this comes from the concept of the nation state that we talked about in the previous lecture. So the nation is the territory, and the state is the organization that controls that territory. Government is the group of people at any one time in control of the state. So government and state are not exactly the same term. So for example, the United States of America, state means the federal government. Who is the government at a particular time is going to be who has the power within that organization. So for example, the president has a certain amount of power, then you have Congress, and you have the Supreme Court. So in the United States, we have a tripartite system in which you have three organizations, executive, judicial, and legislative, and they each have an independent role in government. What are different types of governments? Well, historically, the most important historically is the monarchy. People became a king by either birth, heredity, or by conquest. They simply took the kingship, but they had to have some legitimacy, some claim to it. In other words, they had to have support from others. So it isn't necessarily true that one person by themselves can claim the kingship. No, you would have to have support from powerful sectors in society. Now, in the distant past, monarchs liked to think they were absolute. In other words, they had absolute authority over their domain. In reality, they were constantly in conflict with major lords and barons who often challenged their authority. In more recent times, the concept of the population, the citizens of a territory, the subjects, as it were, having authority, has become much more prevalent. So in the last 200 years, we have a new concept called democracy. Now, in some cases, monarchy and democracy have been combined, or monarchy is combined with some other form, which we call constitutional monarchy. And a constitutional monarchy means that the king is there, but the king has to obey the Constitution. So in England, for example, you have a royal family, you have a queen, in the case of England right now, but the queen's power is actually very reduced. Almost all the power is held by Parliament. And in fact, there are very few powerful monarchs in the world today. Now, in between monarchy and democracy, democracy is a system in which demos, the people, krasi, rule. How they rule, well, there are different variations. We'll be discussing some in a moment. But in modern times, there have also been other systems. For example, totalitarianism. This is when the state claims control over all sectors of society and is mostly associated with communist governments, such as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Cuba, China, North Korea. And in these societies, the state controls everything. Therefore, total. Authoritarian regimes are regimes usually controlled by dictators or a small oligarchy that really doesn't allow any opposition to its rule. They don't necessarily control, or the state itself doesn't necessarily control the economy, although it may be the people in the economy, the ruling elites, control the state. That very often does happen in an authoritarian system. So authoritarian systems have existed many times. You had Hitler in Germany, you had Mussolini in Italy, Franco in Spain. More recently, many Latin American countries have been dictatorships or fluctuate between dictatorships or authoritarian regimes and democratic regimes. So what tends to make democracy possible? Well, a couple things, and there's a lot of things. We're going to just talk about a few of them here, but some of them I don't mention here. For example, having a literate and educated population usually is very important because people have to decide issues for themselves rather than simply believing what they're told. But other things, for example, here in the list, acceptance of competitive struggles for positions of power. In other words, that there are different interest groups in society and that it's allowed for them to compete. So, for example, if the Democrats, when they came in, were to kill off all the Republicans or vice versa, that would not allow democracy. You have to have an acceptance of competitive struggle and of the system. You have to have a strong civil society. In other words, that the state doesn't control everything. There's a lot of other things going on in society, interests that people have outside politics, outside even just the economy, that there's a balance in society. Very important, many people point out, an independent judiciary, a strong judiciary. That judiciary is the legal system, so that the courts will restrain politicians. They will make sure that the government doesn't become a tyranny, which is very important because sometimes people get in power and they want to stay in power. So you have to have a strong system of laws that say, just because you're the government doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. You have to operate according to the law. A stable condition and stable social conditions are very, very important. A stable economy and social conditions are very important. So if you have a widely fluctuating economy, you have a situation where there's wide-based social discontent, huge inequality in societies. This will tend to weaken democracy because a lot of people will be desperate and they will want a strong leader. They will want a dictator to come in. This is what happened in Germany in the 1930s because of the Great Depression. People wanted somebody who could come in and be strong. And when people want that, usually that's not a good thing for democracy. Because the strength of a democracy is not in one person, it's in the system. And finally, underlying consensus about core values. So generally when the core values of a society break down or become up for contention, that is when democracy fails. And in the United States, we had that happen during the Civil War. There was a fundamental disagreement about a core principle of the United States as it was founded, because the United States, for better or for worse, was founded on the principle of slavery. And since part of the country, a big part of the country, the North, did not want slavery, and a part of the country did want slavery, they were unable to resolve this problem. And eventually it became a situation which could not be resolved democratically, which is why it led to war. Political power in the United States tends to be different from other countries, partly, well, for a number of different reasons, but we'll get into discussing those over the next couple slides. One way in which it is not different is the existence of political parties. Now, in the U.S. Constitution, as I said before, we've got the executive, we've got the legislative branch, we've got judiciary branch. Nowhere in the Constitution does it mention political parties. Doesn't mention Democrats, doesn't mention Republicans, right? So where do these political parties come from? Well, they come from the necessity of organizing people into voting blocks, essentially. So originally, people thought that, oh, it's okay, people will just vote according to whatever they think at the moment for whatever various candidates they have. But this is a country spread out over thousands of square miles from the very beginning, and it was very difficult for people to have a consistent dialogue across all of that territory in order to vote for candidates that then would go to Washington and be able to then form a government. So essentially, it was a recipe for disaster. What the political parties did is they said, oh, okay, we're going to organize a platform before the elections, and that will give people something to vote for on a national level, right? So from New York all the way to South Carolina, there would be one political party with a coherent platform, and people then could decide, do I vote for it or not vote for it, right? So in a way, the political parties have become an intermediary between the government and the people. And of course, the big question is who controls them. And there's always a lot of questions about how they're being controlled by elites or manipulated by elites. But in reality, every single democratic country in the world has operated according to political parties. And apparently this is something necessary, because we don't have a direct democracy. We all have representative democracies. So again, if we were to just vote for people locally based on whether or not we like them, then they get to Washington, then they have to hash out the issues. We really have no voice, because we just voted upon somebody because he was a nice guy. Now he goes to Washington and we have no idea how he's voting on the issues. So this is why the political parties exist, for better or for worse. One vote per person. Well, democracy doesn't necessarily mean 100% equality. And in the United States, in fact, we are not, strictly speaking, a democracy. The United States of America is actually an association of states which themselves are democracies and republics, right? So each state generally has one vote per person according to, as long as they meet the basic criteria of voting status, so age and other requirements, right? But between the states, there's a lot of differences we'll talk about more in a second. But for example, every state has 2 senators, which means that California, with about a population of about 50, 60 million, has 2 senators, and Idaho, with 500,000 people, also has 2 senators, right? So this means if you live in Idaho, your vote counts a lot more in the Senate than somebody from California, right? Put it another way, California has 2 votes, and if you took the population of the smallest 20 states, they would add up more or less to the population of California. So in other words, California's 2 votes, the same population in the rest of in the small states has 40 votes, right? So there's a huge disparity in the Senate, and as we'll discuss a little bit, in the Electoral College in terms of the actual effect of one's vote. In Congress, more or less, the vote is proportional to representation. Now, of course, another issue we'll talk about a little bit is interest groups and media. As I said before, the ability of competing interest groups to express themselves is very important for a democracy. And also having a free media is very important, so you spread information. The question is whether or not these things are manipulated, or whether some people have a lot more power than others in these regards. Another issue in more recent times is the rise of the internet and possible intervention through the internet, as was alleged in the 2016 elections, where it was alleged that Russia was trying to influence the American elections by having people send messages and claim to be Americans and raise issues in a way to make one party look better than another. Another issue is, why does America only have two parties? Now, a lot of European countries or other democracies have multiple parties, have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? Now, this is, again, something a lot of people complain about, so I thought it's worth mentioning and trying to explain it here. Largely, it has to do with the difference between two different types of systems for electing people to government. One is representational. In other words, the idea that you are represented by a specific person who you elect from your district or state. Right? The other is proportional representation, where you will be represented by people who you didn't necessarily vote for, but you voted for a party. Right? So when you vote for the party, that party will get a proportion of the seats in government according to the number of votes they got in the whole population. Right? So we'll explain that a bit more in a second. So, for example, in the United States, we have direct representation. And what this means is that typically, in each district, the winner will get, whoever gets the most votes in that district. It does depend on each state. Some states require a 50% margin to be elected, but in a lot of states, you only need a numerical superiority. In other words, you could win with 38% of the vote if that was the highest vote, right? So what happens if a third person runs for election? So, for example, in 1992, a guy named Ross Perot ran for president, and he was a third-party delegate. So you had George Bush Sr., not George Bush Jr., George Bush Sr., who was the vice president of Ronald Reagan. He was running on the Republican ticket. You had Bill Clinton, not Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton running on the Democratic ticket. And then this guy named Ross Perot says, I want to be president too. So he ran on an independent ticket. And he was a wealthy oil man. He had lots of money to throw in. And a lot of people liked him because he was kind of like a little bit wacky, and he would say things. People thought of him as very clear and true and to the point. In any case, the point is, he ends up getting about 17% of the whole vote nationwide. But because the votes for the presidency are not decided by the popular vote, they're decided by the Electoral College. And the votes in the Electoral College are decided by state, right? So Ross Perot didn't win the majority in any state, right? Instead, he only won 17%, so a little bit more in some states, a little bit less in others, but his vote was spread across the country. So in no state did he win, so he didn't get any electoral votes, right? On the other hand, he took a lot of votes. It's a little hard to tell, but some people argue he took more votes from George Bush than he did from Bill Clinton. So Bill Clinton ended up winning that election with about 38% of the popular vote. George Bush had about 36, 37%, and as I said, Ross Perot had 17%, and a few other delegates candidates had odd 1 or 2. So what did Ross Perot get with 17%? Nothing, right? But he may have weakened the candidate who was closest to him philosophically, who was George Bush, because some of the Republicans switched their votes to Ross Perot, right? So in fact, what usually happens is a third-party candidate weakens whatever party is closest to them. Whereas in Europe, you have proportional representation. So if Ross Perot had run for president, or let's say prime minister in Europe, he would have gotten 17% of the seats in parliament. And he would have been the kingmaker. Let me show you in a second, right? This is how the United States concentrates power. As I said, we have a system of direct representation, creating winner-take-all situation in every district. So, like we said, in the Ross Perot case, it was 17%. Let's just say it's 5% for a group called the Green Party. And then the Republicans got 48% and the Democrats got 47%, right? So if we look at this, we'd say, well, 5%, obviously he's not going to win that district. Who's going to win? Well, the Republicans will win, right? Because they got 48%, right? %. So they win. But what happens here? Those 5% of Greens probably would not have voted Republican. If the Green Party had not been there, those votes would have gone to the Democrats. In other words, the Democrats probably would have won that election and they would have gotten that seat, right? So in the American system, the third party takes away power from the party that is closest to it. They end up destroying their own philosophy, right? And in 2000, I'm not going to go into all the details, you had Al Gore running against George Bush Jr. this time, right? And in that case, the election was decided by a razor sharp. In fact, Al Gore won the popular vote. He got more votes than George Bush, but George Bush won the same number of votes in the Electoral College +1, right? And there are at least 2 or 3 states which could have switched to Al Gore if he had gotten only a few thousand more votes in those states, right? And the big difference was the Green Party. The Green Party ran very aggressively. They ran against Al Gore, even though Al Gore was the best candidate for the Green Party ever. Al Gore was probably the best spokesperson for climate change and the environment that we've ever had in the country. I mean, irregardless of whether you agree with that or not, with climate change, that's a fact. Al Gore was brilliant on climate change. So the Green Party defeats him, right? And end up giving the victory to George Bush Jr. Right? So this is what happens in an American system. Now, in a European system, you have a difference. In the European system, because you have proportional representation, if you had the same vote on a national level, you would have 48% of the seats in Parliament would be Republican, 47% would be Democratic, and then 5% Greens. And in that case, the Greens could then throw their support to the Democrats and form a government, a Green Democrat government, right? And in that case, Al Gore and Jill Stein, the head of the Greens, would lead the government, not exactly together. Of course, Al Gore would be the prime minister, but the point is the Greens would have a huge influence in that government. They would genuinely win. So in a proportional system, this actually gives more power to the third parties, whereas the system we have in America takes power away from the third parties. So this is why in America you only have 2 effective parties. Yes, there are 5 or 6 other parties, but they almost never get more than 1 or 2% of the vote. In many ways, it's even worse than that. As I mentioned, in 2000, Al Gore actually won the popular vote, but he lost the Electoral College by an extremely thin margin. Right? Any one of 3 states switching sides would have given Al Gore the election. You may recall they had a huge thing in Florida because the vote was so close they were going to do a recount. And the Supreme Court finally decided we don't need to do a recount, which gave George Bush the victory. In any case, in 2016, it was even worse. Hillary Clinton won by a huge margin in the popular vote, basically by 3%, which is a very large margin in the popular vote these days. However, she still lost the Electoral College by a huge amount. So she has a huge victory in the popular vote, but a huge loss in the Electoral College. So again, this is an issue in American politics. Our electoral system for president is structured to favor, basically by states. it does favor the small states, but more importantly than that, it means that when you're running for president, you have to focus on the states, and particularly swing states, states that might go back or forth. So, for example, if you're a Democrat, you don't go to California because you know California is already voting Democrat. If you're a Republican, you don't go to California because you know California is already voting for the Democrats. So basically 80% of the states, nobody even cares about because they already know that they're voting for them. All the attention is focused on swing states, which are the states that might switch between one candidate or another. And in 2016, apparently the Clinton campaign did a huge boo-boo and didn't pay attention to a number of key swing states, which in the last moment switched over to Trump. They thought they were in their column and they went over to Trump, right? So Trump ends up winning the Electoral College, right? Even though, as I said, Clinton won by a very, very wide margin. So when you're running for president, you have to put together a combination of states, and not just the popular vote. So when you hear about so-and-so's leading in the polls, you have to remember this is a national poll. What's important is what's happening in the swing states, not at the national level. So Clinton won in big states like California and New York. Trump won by extremely small states in a few swing states, and that gave him the election, even though he didn't get the popular vote. So why do we have this? Again, we go back to the origins of the United States when they wanted to give small states a little extra oomph in order to bring them into the United States, in order to have them agree. They didn't want to be controlled by Virginia and New York, which at that time were the big states. So they said, here you go, you're guaranteed equal representation in the Senate to any other state, no matter the size, and you get a little extra boost in the Electoral College. Very nice. So just to show you, illustrate, this is, of course, by now we would probably have the results of the 2020 elections. This is what the 2019 elections looks like. So you've got the blue areas were the areas voting for Clinton. Notice this includes a lot of the biggest states in the country, like California, like New York. You got the red areas. The red areas include a lot of very small states, although they do have, he won Florida and Texas, which are fairly large states. And as a result, Trump gets to put together a coalition of states, as it were, that adds up to 306 electoral votes. Clinton, who, as I said, got the most popular votes, so more Americans voted for Clinton than Trump, but more states in terms of their representation, voted for Trump. And, that was tough. So beyond this, there's another big issue, which is always taxing, which is how much pressure is there on the political system, particularly from special interest groups which have power over the system. So there's a lot of debate about the power of corporations we'll talk about in a few lectures. But right now, let's just talk about special interest groups. So these are groups that have a very specific interest, like the oil industry or the coal industry or the manufacturing industry, right? And they, because of that, can sometimes make a huge amount of money for their industry with a few changes in regulations. A quick example. So if 20 or 30 years ago, a big energy company was ordered to clean up the Hudson River. Hudson River is in New York and is the river that goes by New York City, because they had been dumping huge amounts of pollutants, toxic waste into the river for about 80 years, right? So the government finally said, this is one of the dirtiest rivers in America, the most polluted river in America. You got to clean it up. Now the company, who I will not name, went around and they said, well, it's going to cost us like $2 billion to clean up that river. On the other hand, we can spend $10 million and make a very nice advertising campaign to persuade people they don't need their river cleaned up. And that's what they did. They spent $10 million. They made a huge advertising campaign all over New York and convinced homeowners in New York, or voters in New York, that they didn't need no clean water. That the river was perfectly clean and it would just be a huge pain in the neck to be cleaning it up. Right? So they did that. They were able to convince, in this case, a large proportion of the population through essentially misleading advertising. And who was going to combat that? Who could counter this massive corporation? Nobody. There were a few public interest groups, environmental groups, but they had nowhere near the amount of money this company had. So as a result of spending $10, maybe $20 million on this advertising campaign, they saved $1 billion, maybe $2, $5, maybe even $10 billion on cleanup costs, right? So this is a big issue in politics, right? How much of this goes on? How much do special interests get to siphon off by giving a few $1,000 in election funds, or a few $1 million in advertising funds? And they can set up political action committees to help elect or defeat candidates or issues. And now you have Citizens United, which is a special law by Supreme Court saying that corporations have to be treated like any other citizen, like a corporation is a citizen, right? And therefore they have the right to spend as much money as they like, and nobody gets to regulate how much money they spend. So that's a big issue, because these corporations have a lot of money and they have a direct interest in what happens. Whereas most of us, mere citizens, only have a little bit of money. Maybe we can give a couple $100 if we're lucky to the candidate of our choice, or we can volunteer, which is what people very often do. And I recommend you do volunteer, because that's usually the best we can do. And a volunteer is always worth a lot of money. But at the end of the day, we also have very diffuse interests. I'm not going to get thousands of dollars back for my investment, which a corporation may get. And now, on the other hand, there are public interest groups. These are groups that try to represent the public interest, or non-governmental organizations, maybe environmental, maybe focusing on welfare, maybe focusing on charitable issues. So these things do exist, but typically they're very underfunded. Usually, very often, they're not allowed to make political or express political opinions or give money to candidates. So this is a disbalance, and something that needs to be considered. The mass media is another very important feature. As I said before, it's very important for a democracy to have free speech. This is one of the reasons why the First Amendment guarantees free speech and freedom of assembly, as well as freedom of religion in the United States. And of course, journalism has always been the way we express free speech, because it becomes an outlet for which we get information that is independent of government, and it also a way we can express our opinions. But keep in mind, journalism is itself an industry. And media, the government, whether it's newspapers or whether it's television channels, radio channels, these things are run by corporations. So the question is, to what extent are these corporations then using the media simply to advance their own interests as opposed to the interests of the population? And certainly, one way or the other, the media has a huge role in setting the agenda, because they have the capability to spread information throughout the entire population of the country immediately. Now, this has been used for a long time to, for example, in countries like Germany or Italy, to create propaganda that will basically fool the population into believing something that isn't true. But even in democracies, this may happen. For example, William Randolph Hearst was accused of using yellow journalism, in other words, tainted information, to help spur the Spanish-American War in 1899. So whatever's happening is not new. It's been going on for a long time. Those people who control the means of communication have a huge impact on the way people think about things. Other dangers: the media intervenes or is there between candidates and the population. You may have 100 people interested in running for president, but at the end of the day, the media only focuses on the dozen or so who are worthy, that they consider likely or worthy or possibles, and then they narrow it down through this media process. Now, one thing you can say for Donald Trump is that the media certainly never selected him. He kept coming up, but he used the media also to his advantage. He was very successful at getting media attention, even if the media was laughing at him and they weren't taking him seriously, yet they gave him attention, and this allowed him still to get his message out. So that's the other thing. The media may be manipulated by somebody else playing their own game better than they do. And now, of course, this whole issue has become professionalized. You have people whose whole career is helping to handle and manipulate the media. Whenever there's an issue, we talk about the spin, how pundits will spin an issue to make their own candidate look better. So we wonder, how much of this then is really about the media? How much is it about the real issues? How much do people have a stake? How much do corporations? And again, it brings up a lot of very good questions about how our political system is run and how democratic it is. Another issue is campaign ads and whether or not they're misleading. So as part of our companion piece today, we'll ask you to look at some examples of that. So the question comes down to who's really in power. To what extent do the people have power? To what extent do special interests have power? Or is the power held by a ruling elite? So the conflict theory, of course, argues that political power in the United States and most other capitalist countries is controlled by a very small group of ruling class, whether if you're a Marxist, corporations. An elite theorist like Weber would argue more that there are few people in charge in terms of the large corporations, maybe some other groups in society. So, for example, C. Wright Mills and Domhoff, which we'll be discussing more later, but you can look for their writing. C. Wright Mills wrote about the sociological imagination, if you remember, from the beginning of this course. But he also wrote about the power elite in America. He believed that America was being controlled by a power elite. Domhoff, who is still, I believe, a emeritus professor at UC Riverside, Santa Cruz, I believe, is also an elite theorist and believes that a small elite controls America. On the other hand, functionalist theorists believe that in America, yes, you have more powerful groups, but essentially it's a pluralist. The elites tend to balance each other, and this then allows the population to choose between them. Right? So they believe that American democracy still generally functions more or less. Whether that will hold out in the future, who knows? So thank you very much for joining us for this lecture. Apologize for the fact it went a little bit over time, but I can't split up every lecture. I hope this was a good one for you. Have a good day.